I would like to welcome you all to today's program. My name is Jessie Herman. I'm the Director of Programs and Community Outreach at the World Affairs Council of Charlotte, and we're delighted that you were able to join us today. Our program together is part of the Wunderbar Together 2021 series, and today will be the WAC virtual program with Anne Applebaum, staff writer at The Atlantic, moderated by Dr. David Deissner, Executive Director at Atlanta Brücke. And today's program will be Democracies in Distress, Europe and the United States. We have many wonderful partners and sponsors who have helped us coordinate today's program. So first off, thank you to Wunderbar Together, the sponsoring and coordinating organization for today, as well as our partners, the American Council on Germany, Atlantic Brücke, and the World Affairs Councils of America. If you are unfamiliar with the World Affairs Council of Charlotte, we are the community's premier global education nonprofit, a nonpartisan organization, and we've always sought to bring the world closer to you and to build a community of internationally informed and engaged citizens. Dialogue, knowledge, and active participation and an understanding of global issues are vitally important for our democracy to flourish at all levels. So just a little bit of housekeeping for today. As an attendee, your microphone will be on mute and your camera will be off for the duration of the presentation. If you have any questions or comments you'd like to add, feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom for your questions and any hellos or welcomes or ideas you have into the chat box. We will not be going through the chat box for your questions during today's moderated Q&A session. So if you have something you'd like to bring up to our speakers today, please make sure that is in the Q&A box in the bottom of your toolbar. Today's program will be recorded and emailed out, as well as our partnering organizations will have that recording to send out as well. So make sure you're signed up to receive all of the organization's emails. The World Affairs Council will be announcing our fall program lineup soon, but in the meantime, we have just a few days left to continue registering for our fall trip. And the World Affairs Council trips are a wonderful combination of education and travel. So not only are you going to be seeing the incredible views and landscapes and experiencing the culture and history, but you'll also have a chance for a more educational aspect, diplomatic meetings, business meetings, cultural homestays, and things along those lines. If you're interested, please send us a note in the chat box and we will be sure to follow up with you regarding this incredible trip to Basque Country this fall. We are on lots of social media platforms. Feel free to give us a follow, share some of our content, and engage with us digitally as well. And we'll start the program. Dr. David Deissner has been the Executive Director of Atlantic Brücke for about 4 years now. And prior to joining, he was Director of Strategy and Programs for the Vodafone Institute for Society and Communications, which is Vodafone's international think tank in Berlin. Before that, Dr. David Deissner was the head of the Vodafone Foundation's think tank in Germany. He studied philosophy, political science, and literature in Heidelberg and Oxford, and holds a PhD from Oxford University. After his graduation, he attended the Axel Springer Journalism Academy and later worked as a political editor for the German newspaper Die Welt. He was an Atlantic Brücke Young Leader in 2012. And our other Oxford alum for today, Anne Applebaum is a writer and prize-winning historian with particular expertise in the history of communist and post-communist Europe. After graduating from Yale University, she was a Marshall Scholar at the London School of Economics and St. Antony's College. She's the author of several books, including Twilight of Democracy, Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine, Iron Curtain, The Crushing of Eastern Europe, and Gulag, A History, which won the 2004 Pulitzer Prize for Nonfiction. She has lectured at many universities and writes regularly for the New York Review of Books, Foreign Affairs, and many other publications. Anne is currently a staff writer for The Atlantic and a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and the Agora Institute, where she co-directs a program on disinformation and 21st century propaganda. Also, a note for everyone who's attending today, her book, Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism, will be released via paperback later this month. And if you're here, we know you're interested in that topic, so be sure to take note of that. And with that, we will turn the program over to the both of you for the moderated conversation.
Well, Jessie, thank you so much for the very kind introduction. Also, a very warm welcome from my side. Joining you here from Berlin, and great pleasure and honor moderating this conversation with you here today. The topic that we will be focusing, well, first of all, also, of course, many thanks to the other institutions hosting this event, the World Affairs Council and the American Council in Germany, alongside Atlantic Brücke. Great to work with you on that occasion. The topic that we will focus on today is a development that we can actually see on both sides of the Atlantic. Confidence in political institutions has fallen, and voters are increasingly disenchanted with mainstream political parties. In the United States, political polarization seems to be at an all-time high, and in Europe, political splintering is weakening long-established parties. In the opening chapter of your book, Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism, German title of this, Die Verlockung des Autoritären. If you haven't bought it yet, I highly recommend you to do this. You recount a New Year's Eve party you and your husband hosted at your home in Poland in 1999. The guests included many of the country's leading liberals and conservatives, and the mood was upbeat. The future seemed bright. Everything pointed towards freedom and open markets. Now, 2 decades later, the dream seems to be shattered. Poland is ruled by the right-wing Nationalist Law and Justice Party, which probably considers you and your husband enemies, and half of the friends who attended your party back then in 1999 no longer speak to each other. Now, your book seems to be kind of a melancholic ode to a lost world and an attempt to understand what actually happened in the meantime. So let me start off by asking you, what did happen?
So thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation. It is great to be doing an event that's based in both Charlotte and Berlin. It really is a small world, and the Atlantic is really very narrow. And thanks to Zoom, it's wonderful that we can have this kind of combined conversation. So you've just asked the question, to which the answer is a 150-page book. So first of all, do buy the book if you want the full answer. It is actually already out in paperback, at least in the US. I think in Germany, it's still a hardback, but it's a very small, elegant, not very expensive hardback. So it won't be too much of a burden. I mean, I think the book is, to be clear, is not really a melancholic ode to the past. It's really more about why people changed and what inspired the change. And I wrote it really because I realized 4 or 5 years ago that I had lived through a really important political transition of the kind I'd only read about before in books. You know, you read books about the Dreyfus Affair, when one half of Paris ceases to speak to the other half of Paris. Or you read about other moments when there are big political shifts and people change their minds in large numbers. And I realized that I'd lived through that in actually 3 different places, because I have affiliations in the US, which is where I grew up, which is where I am now. I have affiliations in Poland, where my husband is Polish. He was a Polish politician. And also in England, where I was a journalist. I worked there for many years, and kind of coincidentally know many of the leading Brexiteers, because so many of them were journalists in the 1990s at a time when I was. And one of the arguments of the book is that there isn't really a unifying theme. There isn't a single explanation that I can give you that can explain all of the changes among all the people I knew. And the book is partly about people I knew or know. That was just what I felt was my value added in this conversation. I mean, there are lots of books about Trumpism or Brexit or you know, the disillusion and so on. And I felt that the thing I could write about that was particular was the intellectuals, the spin doctors, the journalists who were Thatcherite, Republican, center-right, anti-communist, speaking very generally, in the 1990s, and who made this transformation from that to something that looks much more like, I don't like the word populist very much, although I know people use it as a shorthand, but they made a transition to nationalism, and in some cases against democracy. So again, the problem with the current Polish government is not that it's right-wing. I mean, many of our friends were so-called right-wing or conservatives. The problem is that it's now set out to undermine the institutions of democratic Poland, to undermine the independence of the judiciary, to undermine the media, and to slowly take over all the institutions of the state that were meant to be neutral institutions of democracy and make them into party, political, partisan organizations. And a mood like that you can see elsewhere as well, including in Germany, although they haven't won any elections yet, and certainly including the United States. And the one, I would say that there is no, as I said, there's no single explanation, but there is one unifying theme. And the unifying theme is one of disappointment. So most of these are people who are, for a variety of reasons, disappointed. They are Poles who became disappointed with the transition of 1989 that followed the 1990s. This wasn't the kind of country they thought they wanted. In some cases, it's disappointment with kind of social and demographic and political change, either in Europe or the United States, and a feeling that our country is not going in the right direction. It's not what it used to be. We need to do something very dramatic to halt this transition or this transformation. In some cases, it's personal disappointment, and it can be incredibly hard, in fact, to pick apart the strands of personal and political disappointment. So there are many people who are personally, whose careers I know quite well, or whose lives and stories I know quite well, who saw in the emergence of a new far right personal possibilities. They saw that this was a way to make a different kind of career, a way to have more influence, a way to expand their own influence and their own popularity. And this is, as I said, you can't really draw lines between these different kinds of impulses, but all of them do have, as I said, what they have in common is we're talking about a group of people, and in my book, I'm talking about intellectuals. It doesn't pretend to be a book about everybody or all voters. People who were intellectually conservative and who began to feel that they were losing, that their vision of what their country should be did not come to fruition. And they felt that there was something radical, something dramatic, and something maybe even violent needs to be done in order to get the country back to some imagined past. We can talk about this further, but many of these people and many of these movements have a very strong element of nostalgia, either nostalgia for a period of one's own childhood or a time in the past, or an imagined past. And in each case, the disappointment with the present and the desire to bring back the past, this is one of the strands of thinking that these different movements have in common.
And do you think that this is actually the unifying factor of all these phenomena, or this phenomenon, if it is one phenomenon, which we can see all around the world? I mean, it's very different societies that we're talking about, very different political systems, different structures of society. And nonetheless, you would claim that this is an experience that people and maybe parts of the political elites have made in recent years. Is that really, would that be your thesis, even though there might not be this one thesis, as you just said in your book, but you would claim that there is this unifying factor all across the country?
It's not so much that, I mean, I talk about different factors. There's, I would say, factors plural. I mean, I just spoke about one of them, which is this sense of disappointment and this dislike of rapid change. Again, economic change, social change, demographic change. But there are other things I write about in the book as well. I mean, one of them is the really radical and transformative change in the way that we communicate and in that we get and process political information. I mean, and in fact, I mean, if you really want a unifying factor, if you want to look at the Philippines and Turkey and the United States and Brazil, and the rise of far-right parties in Germany and Austria, and you want to look at one thing that's the same everywhere in all these completely disparate countries that have almost nothing in common, the unifying factor is social media, and new ways of speaking and new ways of communicating and new ways of using advertising and using communication. And so, so I would look at that. I would look at the speed of change. I would look at the reaction against change and the dislike of change that many people feel, which is, I should say, important to understand that it's a real motive. It's not a, it is true that ways of life or ways of being or, neighborhoods that one remembers from growing up 40 years ago, in some cases really don't exist anymore. And I don't know, the kind of school that you went to might not be the kind of school that your children go to. and the place that you remember well might not look the way it used to look. And that's one of the effects of, as I said, this really, our incredibly dynamic economy. And as I said, demographic change, social change in morality, relationships between people, and also informational change. And so some of what we're seeing is a reaction against that. And then I should say as another point, and this comes up in the book as well, is that this is not in rapidly industrializing societies, this is not new. This is a phenomenon we know from the past. We even know it from Germany. In the book, I write a little bit about German writers from the end of the 19th century who had the same kind of nostalgia and the same belief that our present day is we have these petty politicians and these ridiculous squabbles, and once upon a time we had great leaders and great statesmen. So this kind of nostalgia for an imagined past is not even new.
And I would like to reflect just a little bit on your role as an author, because this is a very special book, and we have read that in many reviews that as opposed to other books you have written, you haven't even tried to, have an objective perspective on the topic, as in your famous book Gulag, for which you've received the Pulitzer Prize, where you talk to prisoners, guards, people in the Kremlin. So you try to, incorporate very different perspectives to get a comprehensive and more or less objective view on the topic. But in this case, you have been an actor yourself in some of the events that you write about. So I was wondering, from a methodological point of view of, reflecting on your role as an author, why is that so? Why did you approach that topic in that particular manner? And maybe as a second question, we have all probably attended numerous conversations on why democratic institutions are eroding and why people lose trust. But again and again, this is a conversation that we have among elites. So again, this topic is discussed, from your perspective as someone who is part of that elite. What is the kind of hermeneutical problem, if you like, and is that the right way to approach that very complex problem that we're talking about today?
So first of all, yes, you're right. I mean, this is not an objective book, and that's because as I said when I began with, I realized that I had lived through an important political moment of, really big change, and that I was an actor in it and part of it in some ways. And I felt that the only way I could legitimately write about it was from the first person, from my point of view. I cannot write an objective history of the last, the transformation of conservative movements in Western Europe and the United States over the last 10 years, because I'm a participant in it, and my biases are too obvious. And so I thought I would try to write something different. And, the historians of the future in 20 or 30 years, they can use my book as a primary source. And then some more objective version of the story will eventually be told, but I'm not going to be the person to write it. I can have some objectivity on events that I wasn't part of that took place 60 years ago in the history of the Gulag, but not about events that I remember and was a participant in. So that's the simple reason for writing the book in the way that I did it. And I am fully cognizant of the fact that it's a book of interest to people, not to people who live in my world, because that would be, a number of, couple of dozen, but people who have some sympathy with the subject. I think that having a much broader conversation about what's wrong with our democracies, and there are things that are wrong. I think our institutions have not caught up with technology. They have not caught up with social change in many ways. They are not prepared for a world in which the United States is no longer a sole superpower. So there are many bigger and broader conversations to have. And I am part of some organizations, or I'm on the board of some organizations that are looking for exactly those kinds of answers. I'm on the board of something called the National Endowment for Democracy, which looks at the question of democracy around the world and what is the best way to promote it and support it. I've worked with, a handful of other organizations that do similar things. So I know that there's a much deeper, broader public conversation to have. And as I said, I'm part of efforts to figure out how to do that, but it's not really it's not the thing that I can do that no one else can do. Another organization I'm involved with is called the Renew Democracy Initiative. I was a founding member of it, and I'm now on the advisory board. This was set up, I suppose the most famous founding member is Garry Kasparov, the former chess player and Russian opposition politician. And it was set up in 2017, 2018, with the idea that the organization would seek to do something like civic education, but online, in using video and social media in order to try to reach wide numbers of people. And this is a brand new effort and it's still underway, but it's one of the kinds of things that I'd like to see more of. I mean, I expect that the question of how we bring more people into the conversation is something that a lot of organizations are now dedicated to. And as I said, it's a big ongoing project, and we're still looking for definitive answers.
In the various reviews of your book, I came across some controversy about the question, what are actually determining factors of that development that we have seen in different parts of the world, and a decline in trust in democratic institutions and so forth. And there seems to be, those people who argue that it's, the economy is stupid. It's basically all about inequality in societies, maybe also in the aftermath of the financial crisis from 2008. Whereas other people would argue more in favor of the thesis that it's all about identity. Maybe also, as you have also outlined in your book, some moral decisions of people who are themselves part of the elite, striving for power, some very personal, stories of disappointment. And it has been argued that maybe that aspect, the economic aspect, isn't sufficiently reflected in your book. What would be your take on that?
So I acknowledge in the book that there is again, my book is not about mass change. It's not about why people voted for Trump. It's about something much more specific. But I do acknowledge that there has, the disappointment with the economy and anger at the way the economy has redistributed wealth is part of the phenomenon that we're seeing, and loss of trust is partly related to the feeling that the system is rigged. It's not as flexible as it used to be. I do find it hard to pinpoint, elections that took place in 2015 and 2016 to the economic crash or crisis of 2007, 8, 9, simply because a lot of time elapsed in between. There was a lot of economic growth in the meantime. And as I said, many of the really most important actors, including many of the leaders of far right and anti-democratic parties, are not themselves somehow victims of the economy. In fact, quite to the contrary, Donald Trump is a great beneficiary of the kleptocratic and oligarchic world of money laundering and tax havens that the United States allowed to blossom and bloom, starting in, really in the 1990s after the fall of the Soviet Union. And many of the leading demagogues, I mean, if you look at Tucker Carlson or Laura Ingraham, are extremely wealthy people. So saying that personally being angry about, some kind of personal loss, economic loss, doesn't sufficiently explain, what's happened in the last several years. And by the way, exactly the same is true in Poland. Many of the leading demagogues and ideologues of the Polish far right are not themselves somehow victims of the economic collapse. And so the economy,
so many years of economic growth in Poland as well.
It's a part of the story, but it doesn't explain everything. And I do think you need these other cultural factors. You need the role of social media in undermining trust and faith in institutions. You need the fear of and anxiety of globalization and demographic change, which are sort of economic and sort of not. I mean, simply the sense that, the leaders of my country, of my democracy, are no longer in charge of decisions that affect me and my corner shop and my local business. That sensation is not quite an economic story. It's also a cultural and I don't really like the word identity either, but identity story. So the sense of loss of control, the sense that we don't run our own systems, that people making decisions far away are influencing our lives. I mean, all of those were really important sources of change too. And those are partly economic and partly related to other kinds of changes.
Mm. And people also seem to be disappointed by the efficiency of our kind of Western states in the so-called liberal world of liberal order, as opposed to more authoritarian systems. Might that also be an experience that many people in that Western sphere share, that they think it's just not efficient enough, it's too slow when it comes to industry projects or even vaccine campaigns and so forth, as opposed to, for example, China, a kind of growing frustration, given the fact that democracy is simply a slower system because we have to involve more people, more voices, and this always takes time and is less efficient.
Yes, I mean, I do think that the contrast between the speed with which you can now do things in the commercial world, I mean, you can press a button on your computer and a pair of shoes will show up the next day. Or, I mean, in the US now, you could get things delivered the same day. I mean, so, and the speed with which you can communicate ideas and have conversations and, on Twitter or on Facebook, by compared to the slowness of democratic institutions, which require consensus and require debate and require procedures. I do think that there is a lot of frustration with democracy. And in the US, we have a special problem, which is the problem of Congress, which for reasons that Americans on this call will understand very well and Europeans will find mystifying. Congress it's very difficult to get legislation through right now because of the filibuster, which is an old rule in the Senate that means that instead of a majority passing laws, we need 60 senators. And when you have a 50-50 Congress, which is what we have, it means that almost nothing gets done. And so the sensation that democracy is incompetent or that it can't get anything done, and that's very often put next to an imagined somehow competent China or some other theoretical competent autocracy, which would be doing things better. I mean, I think if you actually lived in China, you would be less impressed with the competence of the bureaucracy. And also, the bureaucracy in China is part of what gave us COVID, in the sense that when the disease first appeared in China, it was initially covered up, and doctors who were speaking about it in public and on social media were silenced. And so one of the reasons it spread as fast as it did was thanks to this, bureaucratic tendency to hush things up and keep things quiet. And that's that goes along with autocracy, along with the lack of consensus building and institutions. So people imagine some kind of very efficient bureaucracy or some efficient system that would be better than their own. And I'm not sure that really exists. But yes, I mean, the frustration with how slow it is, how inefficient it is, how argumentative it is, and the divisions in argumentation have been so amplified online that we now hear every day a much wider range of angry, divisive, and differing voices than we used to. And this as I describe in the book, is also for many people a source of genuine frustration. I mean, there are people who are genuinely bothered by this, the polarization, the division, the anger, the fighting, and really just want it to all be quiet. And they'd prefer some silencing mechanism. So yes, a frustration with democracy really is very much part of the story.
Before we open up the Q&A, I was wondering whether you might be willing to share your perspective on the Republican Party in the US. I listened to an interview that you gave before the US elections, and there you basically described two potential scenarios: that either the Republican Party would be even more radicalized should Trump win again, or there might be a process of reflection and maybe renewal within the Republican Party should Joe Biden win the presidency, which he now did. So where do you see things now? Do you see a real chance for the Republican Party to kind of reinvent itself, or also, particularly after the experiences, the horrific events of the 6th of January and the storm of the Capitol, that, the more moderate forces, currents within the Republican Party may prevail and help to, reinvent, as it were, the Republican Party.
So unfortunately, the Republican Party, and by this I mean the party in the narrowest sense, so the people who are active members, the local level and state level officials, not the voters as a whole, which is a different conversation, but the party as a narrowly defined active party has made the opposite decision. It has doubled down on conspiracy theory. It is backing Trump's questioning of the last election results. It is looking for political candidates who will also back that theory and that thesis, which has, and I just can't stress enough, absolutely no basis in fact. There is no court case, no investigation, no state election board examination that has produced any evidence of widespread fraud in 2020. And nevertheless, there is now a dedicated part of the party, which is crushing the rest of the party, which is running very heavily on the idea, on it's now called the big lie, on this lie that there was election fraud, and that has all kinds of implications for the party in the future. It means that the party now, or the activist party, is now committed to the idea that only when Republicans win are elections fair. They are committed to the idea that Joe Biden is an illegitimate president. That has implications for how well Congress will be able to cooperate with the president. It has implications for what kinds of people are going to get elected to state level and national level jobs. And increasingly, what we see is a party that is taking, I mean, it's almost like they're acting out the pages of the authoritarian playbook. I mean, creating rules about who can say what, who's allowed in the party, evicting and expelling critics, including some very prominent people, Representative Liz Cheney, the daughter of the former vice president, who was one of the leaders of the House of Representatives, was expelled from her position and replaced with someone who was willing to toe this line and also pretend to believe in election fraud. So we do see a party that is heading very clearly in an authoritarian direction, and which could very well be planning, probably not, they won't make it by 2022, but in 2024, we will have to worry if things stay in the way they are, we will have to worry about whether we will have a democratic election in the United States, I'm afraid. And so I don't see any great internal discussion happening inside the party that would lead it in a different direction. I mean, there are dissidents, there is Cheney, there is Mitt Romney, there are others, and I think actually many ordinary Republicans who are doubtful of this direction. But so far, the most partisan voters and the most partisan part of the party are committed to it. So they're committed to a wide-ranging anti-democratic conspiracy theory, one that sees the American electoral system as fatally flawed and maybe incompetent, and one which may soon be committed to making sure that even if a Democrat wins the next presidential elections, he or she will not take office. And that's a kind of development we haven't had in American history. I mean, you can compare it a little bit to the Civil War era in some ways, but this is something that is entirely new.
And it seems as if, regardless of the performance of the current US president, people would always seem that way, right? I mean, even if, the economy was doing great, or, great success maybe in vaccination campaigns and so forth, it seems as if the kind of track record of the acting president doesn't really have anything to do with that perception of a large part of the Republican Party. He could more or less do what he, achieve whatever he could achieve. That wouldn't change anything about it. So that's so depressing about it. But I don't want to end on a pessimistic note. I was wondering, what can we actually do to also kind of recreate a shared space.
I'll answer that the same way in the book. I mean, there is we all had for a long time this feeling that politics was something like water coming out of a tap. You didn't have to do anything in order to get the water. Yeah. You just turned on the tap and you got the water. And actually, and I should say that had all kinds of implications, so it meant that, you didn't really have to worry about politics. That was for experts. Politicians could worry about it. The rest of us could get on with whatever, making money or mowing the lawn or painting paintings. And we didn't have to involve ourselves in the question of how is our society run or really interest ourselves in it. And unfortunately, it turns out that politics isn't like water coming out of a tap, or democracy rather isn't like that. Instead, democracy is like water in a well. You know, it's a thing that periodically you have to get up and go to the well and get the water out of the well and bring it back. In other words, it requires effort. And it may be that all of us have to make more effort than we used to. We need to be more involved in whether in party politics or local organizations or civic organizations or one of the, really many fantastic bipartisan groups that are seeking to build, to cross political divides in the US. It may require a lot more effort on the part of ordinary citizens. Almost anything you can do, any organization or group or cause that you have time to work for or be involved in, that helps. That's what democracy is ultimately. It's not supposed to be a system where, a tiny number of people decide everything. It's meant to be something that allows participation for everybody who wants to participate. And those possibilities are all still there.
And, this is also a thesis that you propose towards the end of your book, that we might have just been lucky that over the past 50, 70 years that freedom and democracy has prevailed in the Western part of the world, but that might not always be the case. So we have to kind of fight back. It also kind of reminded me of the thesis of Bob Kagan's famous book, The Jungle Grows Back. So we kind of constantly have to fight the dark forces and defend democracy with, all the means that we have at our disposal, right?
Yes, and his thesis is right. And by the way, everybody who, who's ever thought seriously about democracy has understood this, including the founding fathers of the United States, the people who wrote the American Constitution. They understood absolutely that democracies fail. And in fact, while they were writing the Constitution, they were reading books about ancient Greece and Rome. And then they designed the Constitution with Rome in their heads, the fall of the Roman Republic. So they were very aware that democracies can fall, and specifically that they can fall to demagoguery. And they tried to build a constitution that has some checks and balances against that. I think unfortunately, some of the checks and balances either didn't work anymore or didn't work the way they thought they would, like the Electoral College. But absolutely, they knew this was a problem, and we should also be constantly aware of it. So the awareness that democracy can fall is not a pessimistic awareness, it's just realism. It's just being aware that these things have happened in the past and they can happen again.
And I think this is also a wonderful call for action of our institutions. And we, try to create a space where people talk to each other also across party lines and sectors. And I think that applies to the World Affairs Council, the American Council in Germany, also Atlantic Broker. And with that, I think it's a good point to turn over to you, Jessie, for Q&A from the audience. And from my side, already many, many thanks to Anne Applebaum for sharing her perspectives.
Thank you.
Remarks. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much. I think the few hundred folks we have online certainly enjoyed that presentation because we have a lot of questions to go through. So we'll try to go through these pretty quickly. And I think a natural continuation of the conversation we were just having, we have noted that democracy has always been corruptible. So how do we work within this structure? How should our country respond? If we make changes, does that inherently restrict the aspects of a free democracy?
I'm sorry, can you just say the last part of that question again? I didn't quite hear it. Gotcha. I'm not hearing you that well, sorry.
How should our countries work within the idea that democracies are corruptible? What do we do about that?
Well, that democracies are corruptible is something that every citizen of every democracy should be well aware of. And everybody should be aware of what needs to be done to make them less corrupt. And you should, when you go to vote, you should ask yourself whether you're voting for somebody who will work towards that end. When you lobby your congressman or your local councilor, you should have that idea in your head. When you decide which organizations you're going to join or give your time to or give your money to, you should also have that in your head. Just as an example as how these things can move, there's one big issue, I referred to it actually a few minutes ago, and it's something I care about a lot. Which is the issue of the ways in which the US and the UK actually, and some other European countries have enabled international kleptocracy. And so the growth of international money laundering, the rise of tax havens, and then the subsequent use of dark money in politics, in all of our politics, is something that I care a lot about. And there are a few people in Congress and in the Senate who do care about these things as well, who have, there's been a move to improve the legal regime around these things. The Biden administration has just is announced that it will raise the amount of money it invests in IRS and other regulators who look into white collar fraud. Find people who care about those things. If you care about it, which I do, find people who care about them, give them your votes, support their campaigns.
Great. And David, I know your organization does a lot of work with youth, and we have quite a few students who are online today. So I'm curious, what would you tell those students, and maybe how can they help foster these transatlantic relationships?
Well, first of all, I think it's really important to talk to each other, not only through digital channels, but to actually visit the other country. I firmly believe in the value of traveling and real life experiences, which might not, of course, it's still very popular and people might, travel around the world, but actually spending a certain period of time in another country, I think this is such an enriching experience for everyone who did it. And I would highly encourage everyone to spend some time, during their academic career, during their studies, to spend some time abroad. I think that really makes you a global citizen and really understand that maybe some of the perceptions and thought patterns might not be the same in another country, in another culture. So that is crucial, I think. And then, of course, also to really get involved and to talk to people who might not share your opinion. Step out of your comfort zone, talk to other people. I won't repeat this discourse and thesis of the echo chambers and social media, and I don't even know whether it's that true, but I think everyone can do something to broaden their own perspectives, and you will kind of know if you only, move around a certain community where people just repeat or confirm what you think anyway. So really, pick a debate, talk to people who have a totally different opinion, and enter the debate based on good arguments. I think that this is actually what enlightenment is all about. And if we talk about the transatlantic partnership based on values, these are values of the Enlightenment, and part of that is really the kind of Socratic dialogue based on good arguments. And I think this is something that sometimes I'm a little bit concerned about, that people, might be more focused on very personal sensitivities rather than making their point based on good arguments.
Sure, thank you. So we've got an audience question from Stephen Davis. Much of the political commentary I see on social media is illogical, intellectually lazy, and easily rebuted. However, these same comments seem to have lasting power, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. How much of this phenomenon can be attributed to the lack of civics and history education, and how much can be attributed to some folks' desire for simple answers to complex issues?
That's a hard question for me to answer, because I don't have a grasp of what millions of people think when they read things on social media. And it's it requires a deeper investigation, even if that's possible. I should say that the science of how to influence people, in other words, are people influenced by social media? Do they really believe it, and so on, is pretty weak. And I know this because I've worked on some projects to do with disinformation, and we've looked at disinformation campaigns, and we worked with a group who tried to measure the impact of disinformation campaigns. It's very difficult, because what people believe and don't believe often has nothing to do with the message itself. It's nothing to do with social media, it's to do with other things. I do think that there are two things that can be said. One, there is a real lack now of historical knowledge in particular, and historical understanding. And whether that's because of the nature of education and schools, which in America, again, is very hard to measure because they're so different in different places, and people have such different experiences, or whether that's to do with social media itself, which encourages this very fast and immediate understanding of everything, and encourages brief messages rather than longer texts. is very hard for me to say. I mean, but I certainly think it's true. I also think that there is quite a lot of political illiteracy out there, and other people not knowing how the institutions are supposed to work. And this is not just an American problem, by the way. It's quite a deep problem in Poland, for example, which is where I lived part of the time, and I think even in the UK, that nobody really studied the institutions, or they did when they were much younger, and having somebody shout rule of law at you when you've never heard about or cared much about rule of law before, doesn't necessarily mean anything. And so, so yes, I think more and better civic education, not just in schools, but throughout people's lives, finding ways to target people with democratic information and education, like this organization that I'm part of seeks to do. All those things are really important. But then finally, I would also say that I do worry that the nature of social media and the internet more broadly itself discourages, deeper thought. I mean, put it simply, a colleague of mine at The Atlantic called Caitlin Flanagan wrote a very funny essay published a few days ago about being off Twitter for several weeks, and about what it did to her brain, and how much better how much more easily she was able to read long books and so on if she wasn't constantly distracted by her phone. And although she says at the end, she admits that she still really, 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 really misses Twitter, even though she sees the advantage of not being on it. It's worth thinking about. I mean, there is some evidence that this constant, the kind of shot of dopamine, or whatever chemical it is that makes us pleased and excited every time we get a message, is so strong and so persuasive that it does drag us away from reading the longer articles or deeper books, or having the more, sedate conversations that we should have, and that really are more conducive to democracy.
Great. We've got a question from Jocelyn Ford, and we're moving into the China topic now. So do you think that greater public information about the realities of life in China's surveillance state would temper the attraction of authoritarianism among those in democratic countries who find it attractive? And then a second part of our question, how does that willingness to give up privacy for convenience impact the attractiveness of China's model?
So I don't really believe that that most people in the United States or in Europe want to be China. I mean, I don't think there's a desire to live in a surveillance state, or a great admiration for that model. I am in favor of there being more written about it. Although there is quite a lot of good reporting. There's a lot of good reporting on how the Chinese use surveillance and social media monitoring to maintain control. There's been some excellent reporting on the Uyghurs. This is the Muslim minority in China who now live in this totally surreal and Orwellian surveillance state, where everything they do is monitored and every movement is on a camera. And so there's been some excellent reporting and writing about that. And of course, I want there to be more. But I'm not sure that that's the issue. It's more that it's not that people want to be China. It's more that they see China as some kind of criticism of or undermining of our own institutions or our own system. Somehow we imagine that there must be something more efficient. But the second part of the question is very interesting. I wrote a piece that was published a few months ago about reforming the internet. And it was about how we could start thinking differently about changing monitoring the algorithms, because the problem on the internet, I won't do the whole argument, the problem isn't that we need to monitor the content, it's the way in which the content is distributed. That's the thing that the social media companies do, that I feel could be. A friend of mine, a very thoughtful friend of mine, wrote me back and said, the thing that you're missing is that for most people, they like the current algorithms, even though they rob them of agency, even though they steal their data, even though it means that they feed them with content that's designed to, that they're designed to find appealing, even though it creates these echo chambers and so on, precisely because it's convenient. And so it turns out that people will give up an enormous amount of privacy and an enormous amount of data in exchange for convenience in order to be able to do things fast. And it may be that we will eventually need some kind of regulation, because this is such a strong part of the human condition, this desire for convenience. we may need to put some roadblocks into the system. So we may, if people are just willing to give up their data, we may have to stop them from giving up their data, or we may have to make it more difficult, or we may have to switch the convenience, make it more convenient to keep your data and less convenient to give it away, in other words. So that requires a lot of thought. I mean, one of the things that I'm hoping is going to happen over the next several years is that the conversation about how the internet works and how it's affecting our politics will get bumped higher up the spectrum of political priorities. I mean, right now, I understand we are still dealing with the aftermath of the pandemic or the ongoing pandemic, as well as the, economic crisis and other things. But I do hope that that will soon become a priority.
Sure. So we've talked about, what personal citizens can do, what government response can be. David, what is a think tank's role in all of this? Are you guys helping develop policy or publishing reports, doing research?
Yeah, well, I mean, in our case, it's a little bit more complicated because we are membership organization, including different, companies represented from different sectors, and they have very different opinions and a very, very different takes on the issues that we deal with, as opposed to maybe other think tanks who have a very clear political, direction or, either center-right or more progressive. We really kind of include a large number of people and institutions who believe in the value of transatlantic dialogue. But it's, hard to kind of act as a, think tank, as, US think tanks that like, say Brookings or others who might have individual authors who come up with a study or policy papers. Nonetheless, what we do is that we bring people together to discuss very delicate issues, as for example, how to deal with China. I mean, we just touched upon that topic, which is very, very complex and very complicated, particularly for many German actors here, because our industry to a large extent depends on good business relationships with China. So that idea of an overall decoupling from China is very difficult for Germany as a whole. Nonetheless, of course, we see the United States as our natural partners when it comes to values and the way of we would like to live and how society should be organized. And of course, there are great concerns and growing concerns about human rights violations in China. So what do we do about it? A lot of jobs also in Germany depend on export to China, very delicate issues. And what we try to do is to, of course, also to educate and share information about what we know about China, for example, and discuss how a transatlantic approach vis-a-vis China can look like. And this is something that, of course, the German government and the US government is currently working on. And we try to, offer a space where people from different sectors discuss these questions and enter a dialogue, even though they might not be of the same opinion or from very different sectors. So it's very much the value of dialogue itself. And I think as a network platform, basically, this is what Atlantic Bürger, for example, does. And I think American Council Germany in a very similar direction. Great.
I've got a broad philosophical question for both of you that is posed by Quanta Dawnlight, one of our attendees today. She says, there's a noticeable pattern between consumer-based economies and democracies that lead to degradation of social, society, economic disparity, and environmental issues. What do you think some of those solutions might be?
I'm sorry, I didn't really understand the question, that there's a link between democracy and consumer society?
Yes, and how do we kind of rebuild areas that might have fallen because of that, like economic inequality exacerbated by the consumer economy?
I'm not sure what's meant in this context by the consumer economy. I mean, economic inequality is a huge subject in every democracy, not least because a profoundly unequal society is hard to remain a democracy, simply because if a tiny number of people have that, really outsized financial influence, then eventually they figure out how to translate that into political influence as well. And this has been a problem, by the way, that democracies have had from the beginning and have fought against with more or less success, at different times. But I mean, I think the way to fight that is to look at economic, regulatory, and other changes that will ensure, greater equality. I mean, there's no special formula that I can give you right at this second. But if inequality is considered by the majority of people to be such a, inequality in the sense of, of course, there's always going to be some inequality in that people aren't equal. They are all different. There's no such thing as a state in which everybody is exactly the same. And societies that have tried to create something like that have failed pretty badly. But if the inequality is so out of line with the rest of the political system, then yes, then you need to elect governments that look to control that. I mean, it looks to me like the Biden administration is thinking a little bit on those lines in terms of, for example, in just looking at its new global tax rules, which will force large companies to pay some taxes, whereas now they're able to escape many taxes. But I think the answers to those questions lie within the democratic system.
Interesting. So we've got just a few minutes left, and we've got two interesting questions that have been posed. I'm going to ask them both and answer what you would like. So Anne, what is your next book? What is the topic that interests you most next coming up? And for both of you, how do you view current and future US-German relations under the Biden administration? Is anything going to change?
So my next book will be about the collapse of communism in 1989 and the 1990s. So end of communism and democratization. Some of you might know that I wrote a book on Sovietization, which was about the 40s and 50s. And so this will be, the answer to that, or the continuation of that story. It is going to take me a long time to write. It will be based on archives. It will not be based on my personal experiences, or at least not to the extent that this book. So don't hold your breath, but I will, I will eventually write it. I mean, as for American-German relations, I see them as being excellent. I mean, I can't imagine, a president who would be less, who would be more pro-German. Biden is very pro-German. He has long experience dealing with Germany. I do see one stumbling block coming up, heading down the road, and it's already been referred to, which is there is going to be a divergence in Germany in particular, but Europe more general, in their views of how we should deal with China from the United States. And Europe will not want decoupling from China or an end of trade with China, because Germany in particular has such a huge trade with China. So I can see that as a looming issue, not just for this administration, but for the next one and those that follow, and that there may be a different European attitude to China that may have to be negotiated with some stresses with the United States. But other than that, I don't see huge areas of difference between this, the Biden administration and Germany, no matter who the next chancellor is.
David, anything to add?
Well, I would certainly say that of course transatlantic relations have already improved significantly. I mean, they have always substantially been good, and of course it was a very difficult period the past 4 years under Donald Trump. And since then, relations have already substantially improved, not only because of a new tonality, but really the credible offer to, enter the dialogue again, even though you might not agree on all the, details in trade policy and what to do with steel and aluminium and so forth, and in particular Nord Stream. There will always be points of friction, and there still are points of friction, but we really, are natural partners in so many different sectors. If you think about, also the future of our digital lives, how to regulate it, how to work with AI, how to formulate new standards, how to screen investments of, the Chinese in particular, how to deal with these challenges that Europe and the United States are confronted with. And I think there's certainly a great willingness to approach these issues in a new spirit of partnership and constructive dialogue. And I think we have seen that in the recent summits and the dialogues between the European Commission and the US government, of course, also the German government and the US government. And I'm very, very hopeful, and we will make, even only a small contribution, but our institutions will support that process. And I'm very hopeful.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much. And on that optimistic note, I will invite Mr. Wayne Cooper, the board chairman at the World Affairs Council of Charlotte, to close us out for today.
Well, there we go. Hadn't pushed the right buttons. Thank you all. What, David and Ann, what a great presentation, and so very, very timely. Very well done. Yeah, no wonder we have such a great, large audience today to hear this. We want to thank everybody for participating today. This program will be available on the World Affairs Council YouTube channel just shortly. It takes a few days, but I want to take just a moment to publicly thank Jesse Herman. Jesse is going to be leaving us for an executive position with the Foundation for the Carolinas. And, you know, Jesse serves as the director of programming for the World Affairs Council, and it's just done an outstanding job bringing programs like today. And Jesse, we're really, really going to miss you, and we thank you for everything you've done for the World Affairs Council, and we wish you the very, very best. Thank LJ, Charlotte, Noah, and we will see everybody at the next event. Meeting adjourned.
Thank you, Wayne. And I think I'm about to say what Bill might have hopped on to say as well. But once more today, we would just like to thank all of our sponsors and partnering organizations who helped us bring this incredible conversation to Charlotte. Thank you again to Wunderbar Together, the World Affairs Councils of America, the Atlantic Brook, and the American Council on Germany.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jesse.